Thanks for joining me in my wood shop. Today I made some planting guides for square foot gardening. I've got one that has a spot for 4 plants, one for 9 plants, and this one is 16 plants. Basically it consists of some 3/4 inch plywood, some dowel rod, and a handle. What you'll do is you'll push it down into the soil and it leaves a divot in the soil, and that marks where you need to plant your seeds. So if you'd like to learn how to make these, come on along and I'll show you how I made them. Now that I have the plywood up on the sawhorses, I can go ahead and rip it down into a more manageable size. My woodworking shop is only a 14 by 14, so trying to manage this on the table saw back here is pretty difficult. So let me bring you up here and I'll show you how I'm fixing to rip this down. The planting guides for our square foot garden is going to be 12 inches square. I'm wanting to cut these a little oversized, that way I can trim them up on the table saw. So what I'm going to do is make a mark at 12 1/4 inches. Then I will use my circular saw to figure out where I need to put my rip guide. One thing that you need to make sure of is your saw blade needs to be on this side of your mark. That way you have your full 12 inches over here. So now I've got my mark as a reference. I've got my saw blade to this side, and I will just make a mark on the board and figure out how far over that is. And I'm looking at 13 5/8. So I'll come to the other side of the board, mark 13 5/8, and I will use a 4-foot level, my straight edge, to rip this. I've got a couple of clamps. I will clamp this side down. I'll go to the other side and clamp it down. And now I have something to run the skill saw along as a guide for ripping this down to a more manageable piece. One thing to keep in mind, at least when I'm cutting it, is I don't want the blade extending down much further than the thickness of what I'm cutting. So I'll get that ready. Let me grab my ears, because it gets a little bit noisy in this little room when I fire up this skill saw, and we'll get this one cut. Now that we have the rip guide out of the way, we have a much more manageable piece to work with on the table saw. One of the tricks that I use to make working with plywood so much easier is I have a couple of scrap 2x4s that I lay across my sawhorses. This allows my cutoff piece to just sit there instead of hitting the floor after I cut through it. Makes working with it so much easier. Let me get this plywood out of the way, and then we'll move over to the table saw. Now that we're over at the table saw, I got to set up the rip guide for 1 foot. And when you're setting up your rip guide, make sure that your blade is to the opposite side of what you're cutting. That way you get your full, in this case, 12 inches. You measure the front of the blade, and you go to measure the back of the blade. That way you can make sure your rip guide is square with the blade, and then snug it down. Now that I have the rip fence set, we can get ready to cut this piece of plywood. One thing I want to point out is you've got the cut side where we cut it off, and you have the factory side. You want to put the factory side against your rip fence because it should be square. So let me put on my ears and crank up the saw and we'll get this cut. Now that I have it ripped down to 12 inches wide, all I have to do is cut it off to make 12 by 12 squares. Now that I have the squares cut, let me roll down the blade, get myself someplace to work, and we'll lay out the lines and get ready to drill the holes for the dowel rod that I'm going to use. This is just some leftover material from another project that I had. So the first one we're going to build is that will have 4 spots for plants, and that one is easy enough. All you're doing is dividing it in 2. So I'm marking off at the 6-inch area. And then I'll just use a scrap piece of lumber to connect the lines. And I'll do that in both directions. Now you want your plants to be in the middle of each square. So to accomplish that, I will just draw from corner to corner. And now we know where center of square is, and that is where I will drill the hole for the dowel rod. Now for this particular one, I'm going to do it just slightly different. I'm going to make the one that has the 4 plants work for 2 different planting options. I'm also going to put one right in the middle. That way if I want to do a single plant for that 1 square, I just use this one, push it down into the soil, and I'll just disregard these other 4 and I'll just plant one right in the center. The next one that we're going to draw out is for 9 plants. So we'll have 9 squares. It's a foot wide, 3 rows of 3 is your 9. So we're going to have 3 squares up top. 12 divided by 3 is 4. So we'll make the squares 4 inches. So we'll mark up here at 4 and at 8. And we'll do that along every side. 4 and 8. 4 and 8. 4 and 8. And then just like the other one, we will connect the lines. or connect the dots in this case. And then we'll make our X's in the squares just like we did on the other one. I'm not going to bore y'all with drawing the X's. I'll draw them in a minute. Then on the last one, we need 16 plants. So for that, we're going to have 4 rows of 4. 12 divided by 4 is 3. So each one of these squares will be 3 inches. So 3, 6, and 9. 3, 6, 9. And the same thing on the other sides. 3, 6, and 9. And just like the rest of them, we will connect them. And this will give us our 16 locations for plants. And it's going to take me a few minutes to draw in all the squares on these last 2, so I'm going to do that and I will bring you back. Now I've got all of the lines drawn, and as you can see, there's just a jumble of lines on here. I've got crisscrossing X's everywhere. So in order to make my life easier when it comes time to drill, I'm going to go through here and just use a Sharpie to mark the intersections that I need to drill out. Now I know exactly where I need to drill for my dowel rod for this 16 plant jig. Now my dowel rod is 5/8 of an inch, so what I'm going to use is a 5/8 Forstner bit in my drill press. Where I've got my drill press located, there's not really enough room for me and the camera, so I'm going to go drill these and then I'll be back with you. Okay, I'm back from drilling the holes at the drill press, but as you can see, I wasn't able to get them all drilled due to the width of the board. So what I'm going to have to do is drill the ones in the center on this board and the one that has 9. I'm going to have to drill the center one out by hand. So I'm just going to use my drill and try to get it square. If you want to cheat, you can get a little square and make sure you're, up and down. I'm just going to eyeball it. And because I was going to have to drill out this center hole, when I did the others on the drill press, I made sure that the hole was the same depth as the bit, as the cutting part of the bit. That makes it a lot easier when I have to drill them by hand. I can get the depth pretty close. So now that I have this drilled, I've got to cut off the dowel rods that go in it. And I'm also going to put some handles on it to make it easier to pull up from the ground. So let me get my cutoff saw set up and we'll cut some dowel rods. Now that we're over here at the miter saw, I need to set this guide block up so all of my dowels will be cut the same. I've got a 1/2 inch sticking into the plywood. I want 3/8 of an inch sticking out of the plywood to put the holes into the soil, so that comes out to be 3/4 of an inch. So I'm measuring the distance between the edge of the blade over toward the guide block, and then I will move my guide block over to touch the tape measure. Once I have that set, then I'll take a clamp and clamp this guide block in place. Now when I cut off these dowel rods, they will all be the same length. So let's start making some sawdust. And of course, with them being so small, it's shooting out the back, and I'm going to have to go locate these things. There's one. So that's what they will look like when I'm done. I've got several more of these to cut. There's one more step that I need to do before we can start putting in the dowels, and that is drill the holes for my handles. I'm going with just a regular old wooden pull handle that I happen to have. So the Forstner bits actually leaves an indentation in the center, so I'm just going to use that to start my hole and drill it on through. And because this particular hole is going to be underneath one of the dowel rods, I'm going to use another Forstner bit to kind of countersink that hole for that screw head. Doesn't have to be a whole lot, just enough to get it down into the wood a little. Now that we've got the hole drilled for the handle, we're ready to go ahead and install it. Get the screw started. And then I'm going to take and put a little bit of wood glue on this knob. This wood glue is interior and exterior. Go ahead and get that started, and then I'll use the drill to tighten everything up. And now we have our handle for our guide. I'll put a little dab of glue in the bottom of each one of these holes. And because the holes are the same size as the dowel rods, they're going to be a little bit tight. So I'll probably end up using a hammer to make sure they're seated well. Glue in this one. Now this particular one is going to be pulling double duty. I've got it set up so I can either use it for my single plant, or if I'm wanting to plant 4 I can just use this one guide. So let me finish out the rest of them and I'll bring you back here in a minute. This last one that I've got to do is going to be a bit easier. Here in the center where the handle is going to go, there is no recess for the dowel rod. So all I have to do is drill a hole straight through it, and then I can screw through the other side and not have to worry about drilling a pilot hole. So I'll go ahead and put some glue in the holes. If you don't think you got enough in there the first go around, just go back and top it off a little bit. If it squeezes out when you hammer these in, it's no big deal. And once again, hammer them on. And of course, as my luck would have it, I didn't get them all picked up, so I gotta go try to locate one of these. I'll be back in a minute. Okay, I got the last one. And then I'll drill the screw hole for the handle. Get the screw started. Put some glue on the handle. And there you have it, a completed guide. Now I'm going to have a little bit of glue squeezed out like here on the handle and on some of these, but it's no big deal. And I'll let this set up for a day and then it'll be ready to use. And that is how you make square foot gardening guides. Thanks for watching.